What is going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here, giving you all the latest news on Chicago Bulls and NBA content. Now, guys, in my last video, I mentioned that the reason I was excited to be a Bulls fan again was because the Bulls finally put an end to the GarPax era. A much needed end, I might add. But I also mentioned that I didn't think GarPax was as bad as some people made them out to be, and I want to elaborate on what I mean by that, because I do think there are a lot of things that tend to be overlooked that GarPax in fact did achieve. As a longtime Bulls fan, I've had my fair share of heartbreak and frustration with the team's performance over the years. Now you can argue it was the players, the team being unlucky with injuries, coaching, but at the end of the day, a team's success is primarily based on the organization's front office. And when Jerry Krause resigned as the Chicago Bulls GM in 2003, after completely ruining the franchise, breaking up the 90s dynasty, that was when John Paxson, a former Bulls player, was named his successor. Now, John Paxson later assumed the role of VP of Basketball Operations in 2009, while Gar Forman became the team's GM. And of course, this is the front office dynamic duo that many refer to as GarPax. Now, many Bulls fans, including myself, blame the Bulls' lack of success, the chemistry issues, and the toxic culture over the years on these two individuals, which to an extent is fair. These guys were not suited to be executives of a professional basketball team. We can all agree that both Gar Forman and John Paxson needed to be let go of their duties, and thank God that they actually are. I want to be very clear on that, and we'll go into all the reasons why in a bit, why they were not suited for that role. But let's first talk about some of the things they did well while in office, as well as some of the areas which weren't necessarily their fault, nor did they have control over. So let's start with drafting. For all the flaws GarPax had in attracting and retaining players and creating a toxic culture, you can't argue against their ability to draft quality players. I'm not saying all of the players they drafted were great. There were certainly a few misses. Case in point. But here are some of the key picks and steals of the draft they made in their tenure. Drafting Derrick Rose was obviously the best pick they made throughout their tenure, which they did get lucky for landing the #1 pick. They were not supposed to get the #1 pick that season. But despite the injuries that later proceeded in future years, Rose was the youngest player ever to win an MVP at age 22 and was on his way to really be the face of the league before suffering an ACL injury. Many people assumed that he was going to be the best player in the league, and I usually tended to agree with that. GarPax also drafted Joakim Noah at #9 overall, a two-time All-Star, Defensive Player of the Year. Luol Deng at #7, also a two-time All-Star. Most recently, they drafted well at #7. In the lottery from the past 3 seasons, they snagged Lauri Markkanen, Wendell Carter Jr., Kobe White, all of which have turned out to be up-and-coming players who likely should have been drafted earlier in their respective draft classes now in hindsight. They also had some late steals in the draft. You talk about Taj Gibson, Jimmy Butler obviously coming in #30, Bobby Portis at #22. The second is trades. There have been a lot of questionable trades that came from GarPax, but people often forget that they did make some timely trades, or I guess timely decisions not to renew various contracts in free agency. Really just timely trades when it was apparent certain players had passed their primes or their usefulness for the team based on the franchise's direction. They traded Rose when they needed to after it was apparent he was never going to be able to return to his NBA form, which made me really sad, but in hindsight, they had to get that done, especially when they did it. They let Noah walk in free agency instead of re-signing him to a large contract when it was clear his quality playing days were well behind him. Shout out to the Knicks for paying him big time after he was coming off a major injury and had a terrible season. They let Ben Gordon go, which at the time people thought was crazy given his performance in his last season with the Bulls in 2009. Ben Gordon then dropped off in efficiency and was eventually out of the league just 5 seasons later. Another trade which has arguments on both sides really is the Jimmy Butler trade. After Butler had a stellar season with the Miami Heat, leading them to the finals. It's now easy to go back and say, well, the Bulls squarely lost on that trade. I think most people would come to that conclusion at this point in time. However, at the time that they traded Jimmy Butler, shortly before that trade, Jimmy Butler blew a 2-0 lead in the first round of the playoffs against the Boston Celtics. This was after Rajon Rondo went down from an injury. The Bulls were up 2-0, going back to the United Center and playing home court for Game 3 and 4, and Jimmy Butler just did not show up, both him and Dwayne Wade, to be honest. And there were really questions around Jimmy Butler's ability to play well and get along with his teammates, and perhaps it would be worth it to do a full-on rebuild given that Rose and Noah were gone. Up until this season, it was looking like the Bulls had, quite frankly, come out ahead in that trade by snagging future stars like Zach LaVine, Lauri Markkanen, and also a solid defensive player in Chris Dunn. Now, third is team success. Many would argue that the Bulls have been lousy for quite some time and haven't produced winning teams since MJ's era, and even myself would tend to agree with that. But if you just look at the overall record during the GarPax era, it actually tells a different story. After former GM Jerry Krause was let go, the Bulls went from being the worst team in the league to the fourth best team in the East under John Paxson the following season. On top of that, the Bulls had 9 straight seasons of being a 500 team or better from 2009 to 2017, with 8 playoff appearances during that time period. Now, to put that into perspective, no other team in the league was able to match that streak with the exception of the San Antonio Spurs, which has always been a franchise that is known for their winning culture. Let's also not forget that the Bulls finished with the best record in the league 2 years in a row, in 2011 and 2012, and even Gar Forman himself was named Executive of the Year in 2011. I think those are just factors that people tend to forget. Okay, but let's not praise these guys too much. There were a lot of justified criticisms of GarPax, and what I'm about to share is not an exhaustive list. Of the terrible things that they did in their tenure. There are a number of other factors that could have been included, but I'll leave some of those maybe for another video. One was the toxic culture. It was widely known that GarPax were not a player-first front office. A lot of their dealings when it came to trades, free agency targets were always kept quiet, with a lot of backstabbing, a lot of secrets, to certain players and coaching staff. The culture they created, quite frankly, really deterred big-name free agents from coming to the team, even in a big market like Chicago where it should be easy to bring in free agents. Second, free agency acquisitions. Throughout their 17-year tenure between the two of them, GarPax never managed to bring in any significant free agents despite being in a large market. In 2010, they had a strong chance to bring in at least one of the 3 big agents from that class, meaning LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. And the Bulls missed on all 3 of those players and had to settle on giving Carlos Boozer a 5-year max contract. Yeah. It says a lot about your ability to bring in free agents when Carlos Boozer and a past prime Pau Gasol were the front office biggest names they acquired in a nearly 2-decade time period. The third, bad trades. As I mentioned before, there were a number of decent trades GarPax made in their tenure, but there were also a lot of questionable ones. We'll skip over the Jimmy Butler trade right now, just since I referred to that previously, and that can potentially be seen as maybe a smart trade, but most would probably agree that it was a mistake in hindsight, and the Bulls are still rebuilding from said trade made over 3 years ago. Despite their ability to make draft picks, they oftentimes traded away their initial picks in exchange for players who gravely underperformed, namely trading LaMarcus Aldridge for Tyrese Thomas in 2006. People forget that the Bulls actually drafted LaMarcus Aldridge, not the Portland Trail Blazers. And then trading both Gary Harris and Jusuf Nurkic for Doug McDermott. Fourth, coaching. GarPax were notoriously bad at finding the right coaches for the type of basketball that fit best with their roster. Tom Thibodeau was their best coach that led the Bulls to the best record in the league in those 2 years, 2011-2012, and the deepest playoff run since the 90s. But the front office chose to fire him after a season where he failed to get to the finals, a team that was to be honest, ill-equipped to make it past LeBron James in 2015. The Bulls then hired Fred Hoiberg, a college coach with no NBA head coaching experience, who took the same exact roster to a 42-40 record, missing the playoffs for the first time in 7 years. Now, it was clear, at least to me and to a lot of other people, from the very first year that Hoiberg just wasn't cut out to be a coach in this league, but the front office stuck with him for another 2.5 years before they finally fired him. But what was even worse was the Bulls then decided to replace Hoiberg with their associate head coach, Jim Boylen. Yet another coach with no head coaching experience and a bad reputation for not getting along with players. After a terrible half season as the interim head coach, the Bulls decided to offer him an extension, making him the permanent head coach, much to the displeasure of their roster and really the entire Bulls fan base. But the good news is, Bulls fans, we don't have to worry about GarPax anymore. After the season was suspended due to the virus, John Paxson was demoted to serve in an advisory role, and Gar Forman led the organization. Gar Forman was let go from the organization altogether. The front office has now been replaced by Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley. And thus far, I gotta say the culture has seemed to shift dramatically, even prior to the start of the season, with the firing of Jim Boylen and hiring Billy Donovan, their interaction and transparency with the players, and overall approach to how they just conduct their affairs. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. I know it's an unpopular opinion to talk about some of the things GarPax did well, and most would probably disagree with some of those topics, but we'll love to hear from you guys if you guys agree or disagree, or even if there was some factors that I overlooked. Now, it's a brand new channel, so if you're a Bulls fan or even just a casual NBA fan, don't forget to subscribe. I plan to post consistent Bulls content and news with some occasional non-Bulls NBA related videos from time to time, so don't miss out, and I will catch you guys in the next one.